Hey guys, so in this video I'm going to walk you through the entire process of making a painting and what techniques I use, what kind of paints I use, the canvas, etc, etc, etc. So just keep watching if you're interested and maybe you learn something new. So I prefer to just work with ready-made canvases because I think it saves you a lot of time and there's a wide variety of different sizes that are available in the market. When I'm working on a particular series of work, I prefer to just keep the same canvas size because I think it just brings the work together in a more cohesive way. Okay, so the first thing that I start off doing is that I just spray a lot of water on the entire canvas. It helps give the acrylic paint a little bit more working time. So my canvas is ready for me to work on. It's wet. The next thing I'm going to do is give it a colored ground. Now, what is a colored ground and why do you need to do it? A colored ground gives you a very nice tonal range to your painting. Giving a colored ground also really helps you to judge the lightest light and the darkest dark when you actually start painting, as opposed to working on a really stark white canvas. So in this painting, I've decided to go for this pose of a couple, just mid-shot of a dance pose. I think the translation of this picture in my painting will come out beautifully because there's a lot of contrast of light and darkness. And since it's my first video tutorial, I would like to talk a lot more about lights and darks and how you can help to enhance your artwork. This is the part where my camera battery died, so I did not actually get to record my drawing process. So we're just going to move on to the next step. Over here, I'm covering all my drawing parts with masking tape. It's basically paper tape. I'm using this tape because it's easier to come off the canvas and it doesn't really ruin your artwork either. I'm covering it up with tape first because I'm going to color my background first. And I don't want my drawing to get lost in the painting because it's just going to be a really big hassle having to draw it all over again. Right, so my colored ground is there, my masking tape is ready, my drawing's been done, and I am ready to move on to the next part. So it's very important for you to decide on a color palette before you start working on your painting. Firstly, because you're not confused and you don't ruin your artwork. Secondly, because it helps set a mood for your artwork. When I use the word mood in my paintings, I mean the kind of feeling that you want to give when somebody views your artwork. We can manipulate the mood of a painting by choosing warm colors or cool colors depending on whatever emotion you want your artwork to convey. In this painting, I've decided to go for a limited palette. By limited palette, I mean restricting the number of colors that you're going to use on your painting. So for this technique, what you'll need is you need a bunch of cups and just put your paints in there. Next, what you'll do is you'll add a lot of water to it so that the consistency is nice and runny. You don't want it to be too thick because the technique is not going to work that way. Over here, I got my husband to help me out and he's mixing some paints with me and we're still mixing, we're mixing and we're mixing and we're still mixing and it's done. Now you have your paints ready and all you need to do is add a few drops of silicone oil to it. So this swipe technique is actually one of the techniques that is used in acrylic pouring and it's used to create some very interesting cells. So it starts off by applying the paint to the canvas and you can just pour directly from the cup of the paint that you've prepared and just sort of evenly spread it out. Over here, I'm using one of the shades of the green that I had already prepared and just spreading it out evenly to make a nice wet surface to work on. And now I'm just going to start adding my swipe colors, the rest of the colors that I have prepared on the side, and just going to start adding drops of those colors right towards the end of the canvas because that's where I want to start swiping from. So once your paint is on the canvas, you can use your own choice of tool to swipe lightly across the top of the paint so that it just moves the top layer and exposes the paint underneath. Don't go too deep into the paint because it's almost like you're brushing it but with a very smooth tool. In my case, I've decided to go for a kitchen towel that I've sprayed water on first so it doesn't absorb all the paint on it and just gently swiping it down. If this technique isn't working well for you, then there's something wrong with your ratios. You either have not added enough water to your paints so they're not flowy enough, or you have not added enough silicone or added too much of it. So you will have to try it out a few times to find your perfect balance of ingredients in there. You can swipe the paint more than once and even add more paint in between, but do be a bit patient between swipes as cells do take a few minutes to appear on the painting. Now using the same colors that I'd already prepared, I'm just going to fill in the rest of the areas around the figures that I've drawn just to kind of have a very blended sort of a background. and I'll be adding more highlights and shadows to it later on. Now this is not my final background, and you'll see as the painting develops that I'll keep going back to it and I'll be adding some more adjustments here and there. In my case, I'm working with this high contrast image of a couple dancing, and you can very clearly see where the light is coming from and where the darks and the shadows are going to be. But you also want your painting to be a little bit more balanced, so I'm not just going to have a very straight division of darks and lights. I'm going to start adding a little bit of light patches towards maybe the left corner as well, just to kind of visually balance the artwork. So this is the first technique that I use, and that's called the swipe technique. I'll be using a second technique here in which I'll be using a blower. Now if you don't have this kind of blower at your place, you can just use a normal hairdryer, and I'm sure the paint will work just fine with that as well. So first thing in this technique, I'm just going to throw in a lot of paint on my canvas, and you need this paint to be very, very flowy. So I'm just going to spray a lot of water on top. Now you take your blower and you start working the paint with it. Now in whatever direction you want it to move, just then angle your blower at that side and just blow away. Now since the paint that I'm using already has that silicone oil in it, and even though this is a very different technique, you'll still see that it's going to create similar cells in it as well. And this is all because of the silicone, because it separates the oil and the water, and it creates these beautiful cells that gives this amazing texture. So before I start painting, I'm going to decide between my palette what's my darkest dark and what's my lightest light going to be. So in this case, I want my darkest dark to be the green, and the lightest light is going to be that white fleshy color that you see that I've given on the top right corner of my painting as well. Now I'm going to start painting my way in, starting from the highlights and then working my way towards the darks. It's nice to keep walking away from your painting just to get a bigger look and see how it looks from a distance, because when you're working with such thick strokes, sometimes it gets a little confusing just viewing the artwork from such a close distance. Using the same color palette, I'm just continuing to enhance the value relations around the lower portion of the face, just slowly trying to develop the illusion of form and light here. When I start painting the hair, I want to leave some of that yellow ochre from the background just visible. It kind of adds a really nice bright highlight without me having to add more extra paint. So it's very flat and the darks are kind of thick on top, and it's giving a very nice streaky highlighted effect. So I know that I've used a lot of the word impressionist art throughout my video tutorial, and I want to talk a little bit more about what the main characteristics of Impressionist art really are. Impressionist painters often also used very different kinds of strokes in their paintings. Some are very visible, some are very sharp, some are very blurry or soft, etc., etc. And together they give a very nice light and shadow effect to the paintings. And it also doesn't very clearly define one object from another in a painting. You can see that there's two figures in my painting, but they also seem to be a part of the background in a way as well. Now when we observe the colors used in a lot of Impressionist paintings, they are very vibrant, and that's mostly because of this rapid painting technique that is used to sort of capture this ephemeral quality of the subject. I'm also going to try and not blend the paints in too much, because I want each stroke to show on its own and have a certain characteristic to it. Now you'll also notice that I've only used two brushes in the painting part of my painting. One is a size 12 flat brush and the other one's a size 2 angled flat brush. So using large brushes does do a few things. Firstly, it really increases your brushwork economy, meaning that it really makes you actually think about your strokes and makes it much easier to cover a canvas as well. Now, many beginner artists have an opinion that smaller brushes will lead to more realistic and delicate painting. Although, if you go back to, the olden master realism painters, they generally painted with brushes much larger than you would expect. I strongly believe that creating strong brush strokes really allows them to create shapes of different colors and values. I think the goal is to develop brush strokes that really add character to the painting while still communicating the subject very clearly. So another tip that I would really like to give you here is sometimes, when you're standing up so close to your painting, it can get very difficult to assess which areas are more problematic. So just take a little bit of a distance and walk back and squint. So squinting is a really good way to assess your progress with the painting. It really helps you understand and pinpoint what stands out the most. If your focal subject in the lighting is what is standing out the most, then you're on the right track. But if secondary areas and shadows are what is standing out the most, then you need to go back and tweak the piece so it's focused on light rather than shadows. I prefer to make my paintings in acrylics because firstly, they're very versatile. You can almost paint with acrylics on any sort of surface. Also because acrylics are water-based, they're a lot less messy compared to oil paints. They come off easier. You can just wash your hands with soap and water and your brushes come out cleaner. I mean, every time I've used oil paints, I've had to throw away the brushes. I could never use them again. But for me, the biggest reason to choose acrylics in my paintings is for the simple reason that it dries very, very quickly and it helps me finish my projects on time. So when you're painting with acrylics, unlike oil painting, you only really have a limited amount of time that the paint will be wet and responsive on your canvas. Because acrylic paint dries extremely fast and you do not have a lot of time to work with. The upside to this though is that you can add layer on layer much quicker than you would be able to with oil paints. The key over here is to make sure that each of your strokes is made with a lot of purpose and is very decisive. You don't really have as much flexibility as you do with oil painting, so each stroke must count. But if the drying time of the acrylic paint is really becoming much of a nuisance for you, then you can always look into adding a medium to your paint to slow down the drying process as well. So to sum it all up, my acrylic tip number 1 would be to be very decisive with your strokes. Now, another acrylic tip that I would like to give to you is simply that mixing your colors is a lot more important than you might think it is. Now, I haven't really added a lot of the color mixing part in my video because I know it can get a little bit boring to watch. It's just mixing colors. But have you ever really watched videos of other artists painting and you'll notice that they appear to spend more time mixing colors on their palettes than actually painting? It's only because color mixing is one of the most defining aspects of painting. So before you actually start painting, you need to be as certain as you can about the color. Over here, my painting technique, I would call it more as direct painting, which means that I'm applying colors as they're being observed, mostly while the surface is still wet. The colors are blocked in very quickly with a larger brush and details are mostly ignored. This application is considered a base from which to build more additional tones, and then I'm going to develop darker and lighter values with slight variations in the color. Another thing that I would like for you to notice in my painting is that I really haven't used any black for the shadows. Now, just pure straight from the tube black is too dark in tone and too consistent or flat in color to make a satisfactory shadow. Even if you just look around you, you'll notice that, very few shadows in nature are actually truly very black. So you really need to account for those colors when painting shadows. Now, what is a good approach to shadows? I guess I would say that using a complementary color for the shadow will produce more subtle and natural effect. I think the true masters of actually observing shadows were the Impressionists. They weren't really masters at painting, but really at observing nature and the effects of light as well. So I'd like to go back to their paintings and see what colors that they would really go for when painting shadows. Now, if black is not allowed on the palette, then what colors do you use? I find that greens and purples are very popular shadow colors, and also deep blues are a nice touch as many shadows do have a very natural blue tone. So maybe try replacing these colors with black and you'll see a very drastic change in your overall painting. Now, just because you're not using black in your shadows does not mean that your shadows will automatically appear more believable. Now, to make shadows more believable, you need to remember that shadows are not just a single flat color, and they have darker and lighter values even within the shadow. So you basically need to learn how to handle a tone to create the form. Now, I know the theory of it sounds very simple and the changes in technique are very small, but just applying the principles of how tone, light, and shade work will really improve the illusion of form in every drawing you do, and regardless of the subject that you're working on. Finally, I'm going to finish my painting off with a glossy varnish because it helps protect the painting from dirt and dust, and also it kind of evens out the painting's final appearance, making it all equally glossy or matte if you're choosing to go for a matte varnish. So this was my entire painting process, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. I will be making more videos in the future, and if you want to keep watching them, then do subscribe and like my page. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave them down below and I'll be sure to get to them. I'm also leaving below links of my works where you can find them and you can order prints, or if you're looking to buy originals, then you can get in touch with me directly. Thank you for watching.